Welcome back, everyone, as we continue this discussion series on the flu pandemic of 1918. I want to thank all of you for your comments from yesterday, especially those of you who shared your family stories about grandparents and great-grandparents and aunts and uncles and people who were affected by this pandemic that took place 100 years ago. So please keep those stories coming. Thank you also to everyone who, for the most part, with I think one or two exceptions, followed my request to try and keep on topic as far as the pandemic goes. I recognize that there are a great many parallels to be seen between what happened 100 years ago and what's happening today. And I'm not suggesting we can't observe those things. I'm merely asking that we keep out of controversial subjects and keep from turning it into a political or some kind of moral debate about mandates and vaccines and all those sorts of things. I know that stuff can get really dicey and really emotional. So thank you for that, and please keep that going. With that in mind, as always, at the end of this episode, I encourage every person watching to please leave a comment and either tell me something you learned that you did not know before watching this video, or share something that would add to the discussion, something that wasn't mentioned about this particular part of the topic. A bunch of you mentioned the origins of why it ended up being called Spanish flu. I didn't talk about that yesterday because I assume that will be discussed in one of these videos. So thank you to all of you who shared that information. I do believe it will be discussed at some point. So if you like what you see, please hit that like button. If you did not see the first episode from yesterday, the link is in the description, as well as the link to the original content if you want to watch it without my commentary. Here we go. Part 2 of the 1918 flu pandemic from Extra History.
It stalked into camp when the day was damp and chilly and cold. It crept by the guards and murdered my pards, with a hand that was clammy and bony and bold. And its breath was icy and moldy and dank, and it killed so speedy and gloatingly greedy, that it took away men from each company rank. Private Joshua Lee, 34th Infantry Division, 1919. When we left off, the 1918 flu was aboard troop transports headed for the battlefields of France. And though this first wave of the virus was comparatively mild, its time in the trenches would reforge it into a hardened killer of men and help tip the balance of the war. In early April, it erupted among the American troops at their disembarkation ground in Brest. By April 10th, the first cases began showing up in the French army, which generally trained and served alongside American units.
So we talked about this in our series on the Great War. The American army comes in, and they're kind of thrown into the middle. If you imagine the front as being just one continuous line, picture the British on the left, the French on the right. The Americans kind of get thrust into the area around the center and kind of to the right, closer to the French side of things. Just as kind of a bridge between the two. And so the French get hit by it first, but eventually the British will too.
It was hard to notice at first. High fever, headache, and weakness could come from many diseases that swirled around the trenches, such as insect-borne trench fever or typhus. But it soon became clear that this was different. The troops called it 3-day fever, knock-me-down fever, or La Grippe.
So La Grippe is actually a very common name that you will see on death certificates from that time. It's Lagrippe, La Grippe. And it just, I don't know, for me, anytime I saw it on a death certificate, it just looks ominous the way that the word was written, La Grippe. But that was what they called it. And he's got such an excellent point there that because for all of recorded history, disease was rampant in military camps during wartime, it didn't make a lot, like it just wasn't that big a deal. People just assumed it was one more sickness going through the camp, and so it allowed this pandemic to spread rapidly without raising too much of an alarm from anybody until they finally realized what they were dealing with.
It rarely killed, but men who got it were out of action for days and lead-footed for weeks. The overcrowded camps and trenches of the Western Front were ideal tinder for an epidemic. Men lived within inches of each other, their immune systems compromised from exhaustion and disease. And unlike a city where the virus might run out of victims, here, fresh bodies were rotated onto the line every few days. It spread to the British in early May, and by then, there was no hope of containment.
The Americans at this point, the British and the French have been on the front lines for 3.5 years, so they've been there a long time. Actually, probably a lot of them have dealt with other illnesses, which may have already weakened their immune system, like he said. And being on the front lines for that long, you're not eating properly. Your body's defenses are already down. The Americans are arriving at the height at something like 10,000 new troops every single day. And they're the ones carrying this virus, and they're just pouring onto the front lines to the point where eventually there's 1 million of them.
It swept through them like a bad spirit. English hospitals saw over 36,000 admissions for flu in a single month. Only then, when it began undermining the troops' ability to fight, did military doctors raise the alarm. The outbreak had sprung up during a critical phase of the war. The Germans had launched a massive spring offensive, and Allied generals needed every man possible on the line. But as spring turned to summer, the frontline hospitals of the Allies swelled to overcapacity.
So if you did not see my series on World War I, this spring offensive, it's called the Kaiserschlacht, or sometimes also known as the Ludendorff offensive. So what happens is Russia's out of the war. They've had a revolution. The Bolsheviks or the communists have taken over at this point. So Germany takes all the divisions they had on the Eastern Front. I think 50 of them is what gets sent to the West. And so there's 50 new divisions on the Western Front, which gives Germany an edge in manpower. And so they know the Americans are coming, and they're going to have 1 million men or more on the front line. And so there's a window of opportunity in the spring of 1918 before the Americans arrive in force where the Germans have a big advantage in numbers. And so they launch this attack. And for the first time since the very first weeks of the war, they threaten Paris. They get within something like 40 miles of Paris, 40, 50 miles. And it's eventually stopped as you get into May and June. One of the places they get the closest is Belleau Wood, and that's where you have the Americans coming in for the first time fighting against the Germans.
Men on the front lines would get ready to rotate to the rear, only to find that the unit ordered to relieve them had instead gone into quarantine.
I should correct myself. If I said that was the first time the Americans fought, it wasn't. They had fought earlier, but it was one of the first times the Americans were in large numbers in significant combat for a long period of time. Anyway.
Medical tents had run out of space, and some hospitals took to laying patients outside on canvas tarps. In late May, a group of French recruits came down with it. 69% of them had to be hospitalized, and 5% died. By the end of the summer, 10% of the British Army had fallen ill. Back in Washington, D.C., Welch and his epidemiologists finally took notice. The flu, previously ignored, became a matter of national security.
So if you remember yesterday, this is the guy that was investigating measles and focused on that and how to fight it. And so now he's going to turn his brilliant mind and the resources he's got toward dealing with the influenza epidemic.
They set about turning the Rockefeller Institute into an information gathering and communications center for the disease. Welch wanted anything he could get his hands on. Reports, lung samples, information on treatment. So he dispatched doctors to centers of infection to...
So you might wonder, my wife watched yesterday's episode and asked me the question, why is it called Rockefeller? And why do we see all of these things like Rockefeller Center in New York? And, in where I live in Western PA, you see the name Carnegie. When I lived in Western PA, you see the name Carnegie all over the place in libraries and things like that. Well, that 20, 30 years before this, when you have the world's first billionaires come on the stage, including John D. Rockefeller, who's from Northeast Ohio, they have all this money and they become philanthropists. They start looking for causes they believe in to spend their money to give back. And so a lot of them would give to hospitals, and the hospital would name a building or a wing after them. They would create libraries that would get named after them. So these endowments end up carrying this name. That's why you see names like Carnegie and Rockefeller and others, Morgan, J.P. Morgan, all over the place.
Swab throats and collect samples. But all of it remained a closely guarded secret. No one wanted the Central Powers to know that the Allies were being weakened by disease. Upon entering the war, both the U.S. and Britain had clamped down on the press with unprecedented censorship measures. When American officers denied or minimized reports of the flu, newspapers at home accepted it without question.
Imagine
the
that.
British, for their part, tried to strangle any mention of the spreading plague. But with the virus now infecting the civilian population, news of an epidemic started to leak.
Now, I understand the need for a free press, and I'm not here to start a debate about that. But you can understand why that's something they wouldn't want publicized, because it would definitely hurt the war effort. Imagine if some reporter got news, and I think it probably did happen, of the Normandy invasion, when and where it was going to happen, and broadcast that to the world and to the Germans. A lot of people would have died. So you can imagine in this case, if word leaks to the Germans, who have this numerical advantage and are in a desperate attempt to try and win the war, launch this offensive, if they find out that significant parts of the Allied armies are dealing with this illness, that might affect how they behave in the war.
In May, the virus arrived in Madrid, and since Spain was neutral, it wasn't subject to wartime censorship. There, the flu made front-page news, especially once it infected the king.
And there's your name.
It whipped through Spanish cities, passing from person to person so fast that local wits named it after a hit opera song, The Naples Soldier. It was as catchy as the song, the joke went, if more deadly. International newspapers picked up the story on the Madrid outbreak and, erroneously, assumed the disease had originated there. And from those articles, the killer gained another name, the Spanish flu. But it wasn't just the Allies covering up the flu's impact. On the other side of no man's land, the German commander, General Ludendorff, was also wrestling with the disease. Ludendorff had gained day-to-day command of the German military in 1916, along with a huge amount of political power. And
by this point, Germany is basically a military dictatorship. The civilian authorities, even the Kaiser, have pretty much lost control. And that was true at the beginning for many of these nations. This war happened because military authorities wanted it to happen. They wanted to, I shouldn't say they wanted war. Some of them did. But they wanted mobilization to happen for fear that the other guy would mobilize first and get the jump on them. And so they pushed the world into this war because of it. And so they had a lot of authority, a lot of power. And Ludendorff and Hindenburg, especially on the Western Front, had a lot of this power.
He'd used it to embark on a bold plan to save the Kaiser and Germany. And to be honest, it hadn't gone so well. First, he'd planned to crush the Allied supply lines with unrestricted submarine warfare. Instead, it had helped drag America into the conflict. Now, 84,000 Americans were arriving on the Western Front each month. But that would be a surmountable problem if he could knock Russia out of the war and free up the troops fighting on the Eastern Front. Luckily for him, a revolution had broken out against the Tsar. And
with a little bit of help, I mean, the first revolution happens, the Tsar's overthrown, but then there's kind of a civil war, and it's red versus white, so to speak, is one way of looking at it. Think of the Reds as the ones who eventually win, the communists. And Germany helped with that some, because Vladimir Lenin was chilling in Switzerland at the time, and the Germans made sure that he got on a train and made his way through back to Russia to kind of wreak havoc.
To fuel the chaos, he helped transport a famous Bolshevik revolutionary, one Vladimir Lenin, back to Russia.
When that happens, this has become known as a VTHism, I guess. I see a lot of you use that. I swear I have not seen this video. I had no idea he was about to say that.
The plan worked. Kinda. Ludendorff had hoped the strict peace terms he'd foisted on Russia would scare other allies into opening negotiations. But instead, the harsh treaty only had convinced them that peace was not possible until they achieved total victory, and forced an equally punishing treaty on Germany. But at least Ludendorff now had his 50 divisions from the Eastern Front, and he'd use them for one more, all-or-nothing shot at winning the war. He'd retrained the freed-up veterans as assault specialists, stormtroopers. And launched his
If you ever wonder where the name Stormtroopers in Star Wars came from, there are a lot of parallels between the storyline in Star Wars and the Germans and eventual rise of the Nazis in World War II.
Massive spring offensive in hopes of securing victory before the Americans arrived in force. As the offensive began, Ludendorff's army had better trained troops, superior tactics, higher morale, and for a brief time, numerical superiority. And at the beginning, it all went so well. German troops had captured more territory than they had since 1914 and driven a wedge between the British and the French. But the Allies...
And that was the plan. The plan was to, like I said, the British are on one end, the French are on the other. The plan was to drive right through the middle, defeat the British army, and force the French to sue for peace.
Had held on to the strategic port roads and railroad junctions. All the ground that Ludendorff captured was worthless, shell-churned dirt. And they'd taken a lot of casualties. So the next phase of the operation was critical. But as he began to organize for a final push, his generals requested a delay. The German army, you see, had the flu.
You can imagine there were massive numbers of captured soldiers in these offensives. Typical, a couple of month offensive, you might end up capturing 100,000 or 200,000 enemy soldiers. So if you're capturing these Americans, these British, these French troops that have the flu, you're bringing it into your lines.
They'd caught it in June, probably from a British prisoner of war, and by July it was sweeping the ranks. German troops, their systems already weak from food rationing, appeared especially susceptible to infection. 500,000 soldiers were sick. In some units, a quarter of the men were too ill to fight.
Why food rationing? Well, to go back to what they were talking about earlier with the unrestricted submarine warfare, the reason the Germans are doing unrestricted submarine warfare, which just means they'll fire on anything that comes into England or France, trying to deliver supplies. The reason they do that is because they've been blockaded by the British Navy. And so they're not getting supplies. That's why they're rationing food, which leads to weakened immune systems. It's why they choose to attack in an unrestricted way, because they're trying to do to the Allies what is being done to them.
Ludendorff delayed the attack 5 days. After that, the commanders would just have to deal with the reduced unit strength. Meanwhile, the Allies, who had caught the flu earlier in the spring and summer, were recovering. Despite sickness, exhaustion, and casualty depletion, on July 15th, the German army marshaled for their one last attack. A rolling bombardment pounded the French and American lines as they advanced. Stormtroopers rushed behind with fast-moving infiltration tactics. Gas shells turned the battlefield into a chemical hell. But the French, British, and Americans held and counterattacked. And they would keep counterattacking for 100 days, pushing the Germans back step by step.
And that's called the 100 Days Offensive. I know, it's not just a clever name. And at this point, when you get into the early fall of 1918, Germany has so depleted their last real resource, their manpower, in this offensive, this Kaiserschlacht, that by summer, they're an empty shell, and it really is just going to take one little push from the Allies to overrun them. So the idea that was spun in Germany by the Nazis and others in the aftermath of the war, that Germany was stabbed in the back by its own people, that they negotiated a peace when they could have continued to hold, it's rubbish. The Germans got pushed way back. All the gains they had made in the spring, they lost, and then some. And they were defeated militarily.
Ludendorff had failed. Within weeks, he was shut in his office, suffering a nervous breakdown. And by October, he was fleeing across the Swedish border in sunglasses and a fake beard. Now, it would be wrong to say the flu defeated Ludendorff's spring offensive because there were other factors. It was an overambitious operation with a nebulous goal. He kept changing the objectives, units outran their supply lines, and he lost too many men. But German accounts do suggest the flu bled the army's manpower and resolve at a critical moment. And just as it had tipped the balance, it was gone. In August, British hospitalizations fell to the point that they had declared the epidemic over. But it wasn't.
Right at the moment when they're going to launch their final offensives, the 100 Days Offensive, the big push by the American army, which we call the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which is the largest battle in the history of the American military at that point.
It's over. For as the balance of the war was shifting, so were the virus's genes. Even today, no one's sure what happened. Perhaps the original, deadly virus had temporarily mutated into a mild strain, only to have its lethality re-emerge. Or it may have infected someone, even an animal, that had a different version of the flu and the two viruses combined. It's even possible that, as it passed through millions of soldiers, this avian virus was gradually adapting itself to human hosts. Most frightening of all, the war itself may have given it a nudge, because the soldiers the flu infected had been exposed to a chemical agent known to cause genetic mutation, mustard gas. The soldiers' throat and lung cells laced with...
It's called mustard gas, by the way, because it's not made from mustard or anything like that, because it was yellow, and it actually had kind of a mustardy smell to it.
Chemical weapons may have helped increase the rate of genetic shift and raise the likelihood that a new strain would develop. However it happened, the virus that emerged from the trenches was both highly contagious and severely lethal. It could kill within 24 hours of presenting symptoms, drowning a patient in their own fluids. And while common flu strains primarily kill the very old and very young, the 1918 flu struck people down in the prime of life.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to make. Young, seemingly perfectly healthy people were dying and dying quickly. Sometimes healthy people died at higher rates than weak and infirmed.
The mild first wave was over, and the second lethal wave was about to begin. In fact, it was already making itself known on the troop ships delivering soldiers to nations across the globe.
Yeah, because here's the thing. It gets brought to the front lines by these American troops arriving in droves. Well, now the war ends in November of 1918. The war doesn't end. There's a peace. The war doesn't officially end until the Treaty of Versailles the following year, but for all intents and purposes, the war has ended November 11th. And so now you're sending all these troops home, and they're carrying it back with them to all of their other countries. It's not just going to be a Western European problem anymore. Now it's a whole world problem. You've got troops from Australia and New Zealand and India and South Africa. Brazil has entered this war. China's in the war. Japan's in the war. It is everywhere. With that, we're going to wrap up this second episode. I do have every intention of doing reaction videos from my hotel rooms in France, so we'll continue to get daily reactions even while I'm gone. So be watching for that. Let me know your comments. As I mentioned at the beginning, tell me something you learned today, or add to the discussion and share something you know with the rest of us that wasn't talked about. Please hit that like button if you would, and we'll see you again tomorrow with part 3. Thanks for watching.